Book bag? Book bag.
Hey,
What you want to say about the baby?
Javeayah, baby.
To make the hardest announcement that I've ever had to make in my 36 years career in law enforcement. That 4-year-old Javeayah Harris is deceased. Today I'm announcing that we have arrested Javeayah's parents. We've arrested her dad, 23-year-old Javeayah Harris, and her mom, 22-year-old Michaela Herring, for homicide by child abuse and filing a false police report.
At approximately 8:47 p.m. on June 30th, a 911 dispatcher in Aiken County, South Carolina, received a call reporting a 4-year-old girl missing from her own backyard. The caller said her daughter had been playing outside while she cooked dinner, and that she had only been gone 20, maybe 30 minutes. What followed was one of the largest search efforts the county had seen in years. Hundreds of responders, days of searching, a community that would not stop looking. But within a matter of days, investigators would begin to question almost everything about how this case had been presented to them. Not just where the child was, but when and how this story had actually begun. This is the story of two timelines, the one the public was told and the one investigators say was already over before it started. You're watching Morbid True Crime. Psychological true crime documentaries examining the decisions, evidence, and behavior behind real criminal cases. Before this became a case number, Javeayah Harris was 4 years old, living in Aiken, South Carolina, a mid-sized city about an hour from Augusta, Georgia. Family and community members who later gathered in her memory described a girl who loved the color pink. Pink beads braided into her hair, pink Minnie Mouse pajamas, a detail that would later be broadcast to searchers combing the woods for her. Her mother, Javeayah Harris, described her to 911 dispatchers as verbal and articulate, a child who could carry a full conversation. She had a favorite place to play on the property, a chicken coop in the yard, a small, ordinary detail that would become one of the first places investigators looked. It's worth pausing on these details, because in the days that followed, Javeayah would largely disappear from her own story, replaced by search grids, timelines, and legal terminology. But before any of that, she was simply a little girl in her own backyard on an ordinary Tuesday evening in June. The household itself had moved more than once in recent years. Court records show the family had previously lived on Harris Street in Union County between 2024 and 2025, where both parents were named separately in eviction filings. Neighbors from that period later said they rarely saw the family and had little interaction with them. None of that history, on its own, points to anything. Families move, and financial strain during eviction proceedings is common and rarely connected to violence. It's mentioned here only because investigators would later look closely at this period while reconstructing a timeline that, by their account, did not match what the public had been told. At 8:47 p.m., Herring called 911. She told dispatchers she'd gone inside to cook dinner and came back out to find her daughter gone. When asked whether the child had any medical conditions, Herring mentioned autism, though she clarified no formal diagnosis had been made. She said no one else had been in the yard with them. By morning, the case had escalated far beyond a single patrol car. The FBI, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, and the State Highway Patrol joined the Aiken County Sheriff's Office in an expanding search. Volunteers organized on their own. A local restaurant owner began cooking meals for search crews. Questions surfaced quickly about why an Amber Alert hadn't been issued. The sheriff's office responded that the circumstances, as understood at the time, didn't meet the legal criteria for one. For 4 days, that was the entire shape of the case. A missing 4-year-old, a community mobilized, a mother appearing distraught and cooperative on camera. Investigators, publicly at least, were treating it as a search and rescue operation, racing a summer heat wave that pushed the heat index past 100 degrees. It's worth asking, from an investigative standpoint, why that framing held for as long as it did. A parent reporting a child missing from her own yard is, on its face, a common and often innocent scenario. Investigators typically begin from a presumption that the account given is accurate and use the first hours to rule out the most immediate, least sinister explanations. That approach isn't naive, it's standard procedure, and in most cases, it's correct. What makes this case notable is not that investigators believed the initial account, it's how quickly and how completely that account fell apart once physical evidence entered the picture. The community's response in those first days is itself part of the record worth documenting. Volunteers who had never met Javeayah or her family spent hours walking wooded lots and drainage ditches in triple-digit heat. A restaurant owner in Aiken prepared and delivered dozens of meals to search crews without being asked. A local church opened its doors as a staging point for searchers, offering water, shade, and a place to coordinate. None of that effort was wasted. Even though it did not end the way anyone hoped, it reflects a community acting on the only information it had. A missing child, a distressed mother, and a search that needed hands. By July 3rd, with no trace of the child found despite the scale of the search, visible search operations were scaled back. What happened over the following 24 hours changed the entire direction of the case. On July 4th, Sheriff Marty Sawyer stood before the community and delivered news investigators had hoped they would never have to share. He said the evidence now led investigators to believe Javeayah was dead, and had been for approximately a month, well before she was ever reported missing at all. Both parents were arrested that day. Javeayah Harris, 23, was charged with homicide by child abuse. Michelle Herring, 22, faced the same charge, along with an additional count of filing a false police report. It is important to be precise here. These are charges, not convictions. Under South Carolina law, and under the presumption of innocence that governs every criminal case, Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring are entitled to a fair trial and to have these allegations tested in court. Nothing in the arrest, the charges that followed, or the confessions described in warrants changes that legal standing. What follows is what investigators allege, not a settled account of what occurred. The two appeared before a judge the next day without an attorney present. Bond was denied. 2 days later, on July 6th, arrest warrants were unsealed. According to those documents, both parents had confessed, and their conduct was described in the warrants as showing what investigators called extreme indifference to human life, language sharply at odds with the composed, cooperative account given in the original 911 call. Sheriff Sawyer, addressing reporters days later, did not hide how the case had affected the people investigating it. He told the community he considered it one of the most difficult investigations his office had handled in more than 3 decades of law enforcement, and said the past week had been, in his words, heart-wrenching for everyone involved. He declined to refer to the 2 defendants using the titles of mother and father, saying they had not earned that description. A personal statement from a sheriff under significant public pressure, and one that reflects his own characterization of the case, rather than a legal finding. With that account no longer holding, investigators shifted their focus entirely. Working from information described in the confessions, search operations moved more than 60 miles from Aiken to Fairfield County, concentrating on a stretch of water near Debterry Creek, locally known as Stumpy Pond, a difficult, stump-choked area near where it feeds into Rocky Creek Lake. On July 7th, investigators returned to the family's home in Aiken County, cordoning off the property and searching the surrounding woods. A law enforcement source indicated that search was focused on evidence, not on recovering remains, a distinction that suggests investigators by that point already believed they knew roughly where the child's body had been taken. 2 days after that, on July 9th, Sheriff Sawyer confirmed that partial human remains had been recovered, not from Stumpy Pond, but from Cedar Creek Reservoir, also in Fairfield County. DNA analysis showed the remains were consistent with the biological child of Javeayah Harris and Michelle Herring. According to Sawyer, investigators believe corrosive chemicals and other tools were used in a deliberate effort to destroy and conceal the remains. He described the effort as extensive and said it's unlikely Javeayah's full remains will ever be recovered. Both parents now face additional charges tied to the destruction and desecration of human remains. Authorities allege the child died as the result of a head injury caused by abuse and that she was never taken for medical treatment afterward. Again, these remain allegations under an active investigation. No court has made a finding on any of these claims, and the presumption of innocence remains in effect for both defendants until, and unless, a court determines otherwise. What stands out here from an investigative psychology standpoint is the apparent gap between the act itself and the fabricated report weeks later. If the state's timeline is accurate, that gap required sustained, ongoing concealment. Not a single panic decision, but a month of maintaining a public and private life that gave no visible indication anything had happened. Neighbors along a previous address associated with the family said they rarely saw them. Co-workers and acquaintances, in the days after the arrest, largely described a family that had kept to itself. Whether that pattern reflects deliberate isolation or simply an ordinary private household is something investigators have not publicly addressed. And it remains, at this stage, an open question rather than a documented finding. There is also the question of why the report was made at all, and why it came when it did. If investigators are correct that Javeayah had already been dead for close to a month, something changed in early summer that led to a 911 call describing an active, ongoing disappearance. Cases involving delayed reporting of a child's death often turn on a triggering event: a scheduled school enrollment, a welfare check, a relative asking to see the child, that makes continued concealment untenable. Nothing in the public record yet identifies what that triggering event might have been in this case, and it's possible investigators know more than has been disclosed. What is clear is that the timing was not incidental. A false report of this specificity, complete with a physical description down to pajama pattern and hair beads, reflects preparation rather than panic. A number of questions remain unanswered. Prosecutors have not said whether additional charges, potentially including charges carrying more severe penalties, will be pursued. A former prosecutor who reviewed the case for local media noted that, given the destruction of evidence described by investigators, it's possible Javeayah's full remains will never be located, which could complicate certain aspects of the prosecution's case going forward. Even with the confessions described in the warrants, the exact circumstances connecting the alleged date of death to the eventual 911 call have not been established in court. A newborn sibling, born during the period under investigation, has reportedly been placed in the custody of a paternal relative. In the aftermath, some members of the community have pushed for policy change, circulating a petition that calls for what organizers describe as a federal loophole in child welfare reporting to be closed. Legislation supporters have taken to calling Javeayah's Law. Whether that effort leads to any legislative action remains to be seen, but it reflects a broader pattern in cases like this one. A community response that extends beyond the courtroom, aimed at preventing a similar gap from opening in the next case. Investigators have also declined to explain certain procedural details that became public during the case, including protective clothing worn by one defendant during a court appearance, cautioning explicitly that such measures are routine in detention settings and should not be read as any indication of guilt, confession, or mental state. What the case leaves behind, for now, is not a resolved narrative, but a documented sequence of allegations still awaiting formal proof. A confession described in warrants, forensic evidence tied to a reservoir, and a public account that, according to investigators, was constructed to conceal something that had already happened weeks before anyone outside the family knew to look. In the days after the sheriff's July 4th announcement, the same community that had spent nearly a week searching for Javeayah gathered again, this time not to look for her, but to grieve her. A vigil was held in Aiken, drawing residents who had never met the family but had followed the search closely, many of whom had spent their own evenings walking wooded lots on the chance they might be the one to find her. Balloons, stuffed animals, and handwritten signs accumulated near the family's former property in the days that followed. That response is worth noting for what it reveals about how this case moved through the community, separate from the legal proceedings themselves. For 4 days, this was a missing child case, and the public responded to it as one, with hope, coordination, and physical effort. When that framing collapsed, the community's response shifted from search to mourning almost overnight. Without the intermediate relief that a recovery under different circumstances might have offered. Grief researchers who study cases involving prolonged searches have noted that this kind of abrupt transition, from active hope to confirmed loss, with no period of gradual adjustment, can be especially difficult for a community to process. Though no formal psychological assessment of this particular community's response has been conducted or published. We began this case with 2 timelines. The one told to a 911 dispatcher on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and the one investigators say had already ended weeks before that call was made. Whatever a courtroom ultimately determines about what happened to Javeayah Harris, it is that gap between those 2 timelines, the days a community spent searching for a child who prosecutors allege could not be found, that will likely define how this case is remembered. Thank you for watching Morbid True Crime. Subscribe for more documentary investigations examining the psychology and evidence behind real criminal cases.